Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're just going to wait for a couple people to pop in, and then we'll get started here in just a second. Hey guys, hey everyone. All right. This is our second webinar that we've done with video live from our at-home posts for the most of us. Brett is coming to us actually from the Anvil office because the Wi-Fi is a little bit better for him there. So don't worry, he's the only one there. Everyone else is safely at home, but still following those 6 feet away guides. So happy that all of you could join us today. All right. And I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks, everyone. Welcome to Deep Dive into Attribution Modeling. This is our webinar. I'm Carolyn Chavetta, and this is the first time in 3 weeks that I've worn a real shirt. So this is a pretty exciting day for all of us over here. I'm the Business Development Manager at Anvil Analytics and Insights, and we are so happy that you can join us here for the next hour. Brett has some really awesome tips and tricks to bring to you when it comes to attribution modeling. But before we get into that, I just want to give you a little rundown. If some of you are newer to our webinars and aren't really sure who Anvil is, I want to break it down for you a little bit. So Anvil Analytics and Insights, we are a full service agency that specializes in creating impactful outcomes through data. So the insights that data can provide us help guide our clients in more meaningful ways to measure those KPIs, to track budget effectiveness, and to move the needle where it matters most for you guys. So we have a full development team, analytics, strategy, paid, and design team, and we can provide measurement for planning and auditing, growth strategy and implementation, as well as growth management and optimization. I think all of those things are super important to everybody right now, as we're all trying to not only track what's currently happening, but we're also trying to figure out how do we grow, how do we measure that growth, how do we make sure and attribute that growth to the correct channels. So we're going to be jumping into that. Wanted to let you know that I will be providing my contact information in the chat box. So if some of you are newer to our webinars, notice you have a Q&A box and a chat box down below. If you want to go ahead and hit that chat, I would love to see who's joining us today. Send us your name, your company, maybe something that's making you happy today. Let us know what is providing some sort of joy to you. I can tell you that I am loving the weather. I don't know where all of you are coming from. We're here in the Midwest, and right now a little bit of sunshine and just sort of being outside more with my dog has been great. So again, drop us a chat with your name, maybe your company, what you're doing, and what's making you happy right now, because I think we can all appreciate the fact that we probably need a little bit of joy in this time. So hi, Brian. Thanks so much for joining us. Your son is next to you in his online class. Love that. Hi, Zach. Nice to have you attend our webinar. He's learning so much today. This is really going to be next level for Zach. I'm excited for him. So yeah, drop your name. On that note, I'm going to introduce you to our guest speaker. He's our Director of Analytics and Data Science at Anvil. So basically, he's our lead strategist on anything that has to do with analytics and how to measure anything. It's Brett Lohmeyer. Welcome, Brett.
All right. Thanks, Carolyn. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Great. So I just want to welcome everyone to this deep dive into attribution modeling. So I read this quote online a few weeks ago, and I thought it was really good. So I just wanted to start with that. So it just talks about what attribution modeling is. So it's providing a clear view of what channels and campaigns contributed most to your business success. It's fundamental to iterating, improving, and growing your marketing. Yet even companies with advanced analytics features face the challenge of how to best attribute performance across many user interactions. It is not easy. So today we're going to spend the better part of an hour going over how to understand and compare different attribution models, and then comparing results across platforms that are using various attribution models, and then sort of ideal attribution model or models for your business. So let's go ahead and get started. And then if you guys have questions, Carolyn will just let me know while I'm going through the slides. So attribution model has been a hot topic of discussion for a few years now in the marketing world. I know I've been thinking about it for a long time. Yet understanding what it is not something that requires like a degree in mathematics. To get started, let's just agree on what an attribution model is, and then we can kind of talk a bit about the history. So at its core, a marketing attribution model is a set of rules to determine what source should be given credit for a conversion. But really, how are these rules created and why? So I'll say this, we really don't get into mathematics here, but it is about mathematical modeling. And a lot of these models are very simple though. A few are kind of complex, but a model is really a powerful tool that's been used to, say, land astronauts on the moon, but unlike that, and doing things like predicting the weather or how a spaceship can use the gravity of the moon as a slingshot, most forms of attribution modeling are pretty easy to understand. Yet, even though these models can be easy to understand, they have some big weaknesses. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. This is a very common phrase in the world of statistics. So at the end of the day, a model is just a representation of reality, but it's not reality. All that is true, and this is true of all attribution models. So each model is a set of rules, but no rules can fully account for every reality. The difficulty is knowing if your model is better than nothing at all. In fact, one of the earliest attribution models for marketing has a lot of issues, but I still see this model being used by a lot of organizations and traditional marketing companies. How did you hear about us? So Carolyn's going to put up a quick survey. Let's see right here.
Yep. So we just launched a poll. We want to know, do you still ask, how did you hear about us, as a way to measure the success of your marketing efforts? And let us know.
Yeah, and the answers are anonymous, so don't feel bad. And it's not the worst model. It's definitely a model that people have been using. So this is an attribution model, but it has two issues that some of the digital attribution models that we'll go over today and say Google Analytics, Campaign Manager, Facebook, etc., can kind of overcome. The first is they only really see leads. You can't tell how many saw your different sources. And second, they have a high level of bias from your participants. And for those who know, bias is when your data is not representative of all possible data. And there's something to gain from having a customer tell you why they think they made their purchase, but it's very possible that we have some issues if you're biased, that say they don't remember what was actually the catalyst for them, to become a customer, for making that call. Well, that's good. So we have a few people saying they do ask it. Not everybody's using it, but it's a fair share. And it's one of the models, I've run across a lot. So another issue though with it is that they may not recall at all how they looked it up or what they were using to make that purchase. So they might just make it up, like, and you send them a list and say like, oh, I that newsletter or something. And then the biggest thing is they're likely influenced by multiple sources. So we're leaving out critical information when we're just asking that, how'd you hear about this?
Brett, you know what this makes me think of? Car dealerships. Because whenever you come in, they go, how did you come to our lot? And you're saying, well, I don't really know, because there's billboards and there's ads and there's newspaper and you were probably on some app. So, I mean, at the end of the day, as a consumer, half the time if I'm at a car dealership, I just sort of go, I saw you online, whatever that means.
And as a marketer, how do you work with that? How do you use that data smartly to make decisions? So today we have attribution models that they're still far from perfect, but we have ways to address many of the problems we get from the simple, how'd you hear from us? So I'm going to start with one of the simplest attribution models, which is called the last click attribution model. The rule for last click attribution model is very simple. The session that you converted is the session that gets 100% credit for the conversion. So if you came to the site and converted on Tuesday from Google Ads is going to get that conversion. It doesn't matter in the last 2 weeks you visited the site from Facebook post or organic search for your product, you just typed it in the URL. But if you didn't convert on any of these visits, they don't count against it. So the first thing it does a good job of removing that user bias. But user bias is replaced by recency bias. Now we can see right away that this model is far from perfect. But as we dig deeper into this presentation, you'll see that it's further from perfect than you might imagine. The interesting thing is it's basically the default attribution model used by Google Analytics. And why is that? I think it's likely because it's the easiest model to build from your data. And also, I think it is good to know what was the channel that actually drove that conversion. I think that's pretty important to know. And I was a little deceptive earlier when I said it's basically the default attribution model by using Google Analytics. So although it is basically the model, the default model for Google Analytics is last click non-direct attribution. So for the user journey that we saw before, this model would give the exact same result. If we go back here, we both see is Google Ads gets the actual conversion. Well, what happens though is if you kind of change direct to that last position, it will look back at what is the last session before that in the funnel and would give it. So in this case, it would give it to Facebook because direct is ignored in this last click non-direct model. The caveat to this rule is if there are no non-direct activities before this conversion, the direct will get this conversion. So even in Google Analytics, you will see conversions going to direct. The number one issue with this model is it assumes the last source is the only marketing effort that drives conversions, like sales or leads to your website. It's been an adage in marketing that it takes 7 touches to convert. But giving all the credit to the last touch is saying they really only care about getting people to convert as fast as possible. In our example above, LinkedIn would need the person to convert the first time the user visited the site to get any credit. And do we have a question?
Yeah, we have a comment came in from Brian. Thank you, Brian. He said, analytics is set for the last click for us, and the majority of our people come back via organic or direct for the sales. So the marketers lose a lot of attribution. I've been converting the higher ups to want to look elsewhere. And I think also that even plays into the idea of when you're a consumer, if you're going to Facebook versus maybe doing an organic search, those are two different types of consumers. Facebook to me seems a little bit more, you're making a quick decision. You're almost making a decision where you're like, yeah, I like that. I want to buy that. Whereas Google, you're doing a little bit more research. You're maybe looking at more reviews or, seeing comparables. So it's very interesting when you're attributing in those things, how that can be very tricky very quickly. Brett, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and my main thought sort of is this with this model is it's sort of asking someone to marry you on the first date, because you're basically focusing like all I care about is getting that conversion, and anything before it doesn't count. So you're like, if I was dating someone, I need to convert right away, but that's not going to be very successful. And it's just, that's not very successful to get a first-time visitor to your site to make a purchase. I can remember the first time I visit like shopping sites, and for me, it takes a few visits before I can commit to making a purchase. So maybe I don't have the time. Maybe I need to ask my wife what she thinks. Maybe my kids are jumping all over me because we're all stuck together in quarantine. None of those times does it actually matter what source I came through. It's all these other factors that are contributing why I didn't make that purchase right away. So these are some of the issues that last click models, but there's some other issues too. So as we said before, it ignores all previous visits to the website. And this is the same issue with how did you hear about us, right? We're only seeing this one source and saying this one source is the truth. And although this might be one of the better sources to pick, You could also make that same argument for how did you hear about us, right? Say like, well, maybe that's the most influential, so maybe that's the one that matters the most. But as we said, that multiple touch situation, we're really ignoring it and saying like, hey, what all those other activities, and Facebook might be great at earlier in the stage, or Twitter or whatever, and it's not getting any attention. If you move all your budgets away from those, you might see a decrease in conversions, even though it seemed like all your conversions were coming from this last click. And that's really difficult because Google Analytics is so built around this model that as you're slicing and looking your data all these different ways, it's really ignoring that fact that all these other channels have contributed to that success, those many touches along the way to make someone act. So the next issue is it also assumes you understand the rule of a session. So the next issue is in the attribution model is that your model is built on other models. So as we said, a model is just a representation of reality. Well, your representation of reality here is more terms that are also representations of reality. Let's just look at it here of what a session is. So by default, a session is a set of hits that have no more than 30 minutes between any two events from the same user. I know that sounds really technical, but basically if you come to the page at 12 o'clock, and then you're looking at that page, and then at 12:29, you click a link to go to in that site on the navigation or whatever, and you go to another page. Well, now it links those two together. It says in that session you were on page 1, and then for 29 minutes, and then you hit page 2. And if you leave the site, we actually don't know how long you were on page 2. We just know you're on page 1 and page 2. Now, if there's a gap of you were on page 1 and then 31 minutes you were on page 2, well, now you have 2 sessions. And the first session, you came from whatever, Facebook. And the second section, it says you came direct, right? Because you didn't have another source. You just came directly from the own site. So I even want to break it down into further a little bit more. So to understand the last click attribution model, so you need to know that it has to be within the 30 minutes. But it's also possible to change this model. So this assumption that a session is 30 minutes is also an assumption that no one's made a change to your Google Analytics. In fact, you can make changes to your session to 1 minute, or you can make it for hours. So say for instance, you have a website with 45-minute training videos. If a user comes to the site, watches a video, and then watches another video, how many sessions do you think you'd have for these 3 activities? And the answer is it depends. First, are you even tracking videos at all? If you're not, and Google Analytics doesn't out of the box, you don't even know that they're even watching these videos. So all you have is really you'd have a page view. So you'd have 1 session. If you do start tracking videos, but you still have that 30-minute session setting, then you'd have 2 sessions. Session 1 would be a page view and a video view, and the second session would just be a video view. And once again, if the user came from a Facebook ad, and that first session would have the source of Facebook, and that second session would have, it wouldn't be Facebook, it wouldn't be unknown, it would be direct. And I don't know if you guys know a lot about direct, and it probably would have been a good example I should have told Carolyn to maybe have a poll here, but basically direct is a bit of a catch-all, and it's another model. Basically it says if there's no defined source, then the source is direct. And I know a lot of people think direct, oh, that means they literally typed our website into the URL. But most of the time, that's not how people do direct. And I don't know about you, but I definitely have a lot of coworkers, and maybe Carolyn, you're guilty of this, will have a bunch of tabs open in their Chrome browser. Is that true?
I try not to have tabs open, but yes, I know a handful of people that it literally gives me anxiety to think about their 40 tabs open at the same time. Yes.
Right. So when you do that, you're sort of breaking the whole concept of source, because you have that tab open and then you go do other stuff. And then maybe later that day or even the next day, you come back in, you're like, oh yeah, I was in the middle of this transaction. You finish it out. But Google Analytics is saying, oh, well, this isn't connected to those activities from yesterday or the day before. That's a whole different session. So now I'm counting a whole new session of this direct traffic. And so direct is getting all this value. It's part of the reason I think this last click non-direct is sort of become their default model, because so many people are doing this thing of just leaving pages open, or even the concept of if you just have page view tracking, it's very possible people are doing activities on the site that are important, that are behaviors, but your Google Analytics isn't tracking them. So it doesn't know these things are happening. All it knows is you looked at a page.
So can I ask a question here?
Absolutely.
First of all, I want to do a quick shout out. If any of you have questions that are coming in during this, I may have forgot to mention, hit that Q&A button at the bottom. You can ask an anonymous question, or you can ask a question as yourself. I'll be able to answer those either live with Brett, or we'll be able to type something back to you. And yes, Julia, the attribution model nightmare, she says hashtag tabs on tabs. You're giving me anxiety just thinking about it. Stop it. But my main question is, I think we're all used to, like in an e-commerce setting, we're all used to seeing an ad maybe on Instagram or Facebook of something that we might actually buy as a impulse purchase. But let's say I click on that Instagram ad, it pulls me to their site. I like it, but I'm not ready to buy it right then. I'm kind of a person that I like to go back at my desktop browser, maybe still on the same Wi-Fi network. I like to go on my desktop browser and look at that product again, but I always Google search it because I never really remember the company name or exactly what the website was. So I'll Google search whatever I thought it was, right? And then I click in. So is that something where Instagram and Facebook are then connecting to your desktop? Can it see that I did both of those actions, even if it was within a 30-minute session? Or does that still consider 2 sessions because it's 2 different engagements, devices?
That's an awesome question. And another huge issue, and I know we had a previous webinar about kind of like pixels and how they work. And so that kind of fits in there. So some pixels, because you're able to identify that you're the same user across these different devices, then they're able to string that together. So if you were in, say, on Chrome on your phone and then Chrome on your computer, there is a setting in Google Analytics that it kind of like helps tie those people together. It's like, oh yeah, this is the same person. And because by default, Google Analytics uses cookies. So I don't know if you guys are all familiar with cookies, but basically it's a little key and value. So you say, my cookie is GA_ID and my value is 12345. And that's my number. That is actually assigned at the browser. So it's in my Chrome browser on my computer, and my Chrome browser on my phone has a different ID. So it's GA whatever, 1234557. And so Google Analytics see those as different people. And so in that case, they would say those are different sessions. Those are even different users, in which my next slide, I talk a bit about the user stuff. But that is another common issue, is that the way people behave these days is very hard for a lot of stuff to track. Things like Facebook and Google, which are sort of everywhere and kind of see you in a lot of different places, have a lot more power over someone like Twitter or your display media tools that don't have that big of a lens to say, oh, you saw it on the phone and you saw it on your desktop and then you saw it on your other desktop, and I'm able to string all those people together.
So Instagram and Facebook in that case aren't necessarily getting the attribution for basically engaging that consumer first, because even though they can kind of understand you're the same person, you're saying most likely would attribute it to the desktop and that session.
Right. Now, Facebook is a little more, their model's a little more greedy, and they are definitely seeing a lot more than almost any other website. I think Facebook and Google see so much activity. They are able to string that together to a certain extent, but that is definitely not something you should automatically assume, and you should always be aware of that. And that gets back to the whole concept. These models are far from perfect. They have a lot of pitfalls, and as technology grows and user behavior kind of changes, these technologies have a hard time keeping up. Which kind of goes into my next slide here is, we have this concept of 30 minutes, but we also have this concept of hit. What is a hit? Do you know what a hit is? It's it's like a page view. It's an event, which are things you create, like, oh, they watched a video, or they clicked this call to action and they filled out a form. And it also includes transactions. So all these things are hits, and those are the things that are stringed together. So making sure you know what a hit is, because if you go on a website and you just read a page for 30 minutes, there's a single hit, because Google doesn't know that you read that page for 30 minutes unless you put some sort of timer events, which, those can be manipulated as well. So it's really a tricky thing. And the next thing is this, what is a user? So it's usually defined as a cookie on a specific web browser on a specific computer. But you can get more complex when you start tracking user IDs. So Facebook knows you log into Facebook, and that gives Facebook so much power because it knows, okay, this is you. You chose to log in. I know who you are. And when you log into Facebook, you're probably logged in on your desktop browser. You're logged in on your your app on your phone. You're logged in the browser on your phone. You're logged in Facebook in a lot of different places. So Facebook is able to see that's you, that's Carolyn, all over these places and able to string that together. And Google Analytics has that as well. And it has a built-in one that sort of uses the actual Chrome browser to help track that. That's been in works for about a year that they've been releasing that. And there's one you can manually do where, say, like if you're logging into, say you have a platform, when you log in, you can send that login to Google Analytics and say, this is that person. So when you log in on your phone and you log in on your computer, Google Analytics is able to string that together and say, oh, that's the same person. Now, they still might come up as separate sessions, even within that time frame, because you are doing it on different devices. So, and then the last thing too is sort of like, where do these hits kind of come from? So, and this gets pretty complicated here, but by default, it has this JavaScript on your site that when you click an action, the JavaScript is listening. And if it hears, oh, this action, you requested a new page or whatever, then it shoots off a message. But there's also a thing called a measurement protocol, where literally things like a smart fridge or an app or something that's maybe even offline at the time can store information, behavior that you're doing in that technology and send that data along to Google Analytics after the fact. And so that can also add in some complexity there of like, how is that actually connected up to the same user? Because it might not be. It might be very difficult to connect that all up. And I apologize if there's a lot here, but the simple truth is saying like, oh, what is a session? It's a really difficult question. And not fully understanding all these different models can leave you at high and dry and look in a bad place when you're saying like, oh, well, this bounce rate was really high, but maybe you just are accounting for all the different type of activity people could be doing, and maybe they aren't really bouncing. They're just doing activities that you aren't tracking.
So do you recommend companies and people trying to figure out this very complex sort of thing to define what they consider a session, define what they consider, all of these different things, and then test it for X amount of time, and then kind of go back and check every so many, whatever, months, weeks, and optimize that? Change as needed? Or like, what are your thoughts on that?
That's pretty difficult because Google Analytics really only processes your data one time. So in order to do a test like that, you'd almost need multiple Google Analytics accounts on your property. So that'd be a pretty complex test. What we do normally is a couple of things. One is we're going to look at your business and say, what type of activities you're doing? What is the window of time that like people are looking at things? Like, are you selling, a piece of candy, which might be like, I'm looking at it today, I'm looking at it tomorrow, I'm looking at it for a couple of weeks and then making a purchase, versus a house or a car, which I might make 6 months or a year thinking about this before I make a purchase. So looking at that, how big of a window do you want? And then also going back to the whole concept of videos, like if you have something on your site where we know somebody's not gonna behave for over 30 minutes, but it's still, after that 30 minutes, they're gonna do another behavior that you wanna string all together, then you need to adjust these different settings in Google Analytics so it fits your business model. So
same thing, maybe even for like a product versus a service.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the main thing here is just having at least one person at your company having really good domain knowledge of Google Analytics or whatever tools you're using, and asking those tough questions, being a investigative reporter and saying like, you said this is a conversion. Well, what does that mean? What is a conversion? How are you defining that? And then when they say all these things like, oh, it's a set of hits and it's over, a session, like, well, what's a session? What's a hit? What are all these things? Ask those questions and get the truth, because unfortunately, a lot of companies, they just want to make it look like they're doing the best. Facebook wants you to think Facebook drove all the conversions ever. But that's probably not the truth. Maybe they're a part of it, but they weren't the sole reason those conversions happened. All right. So The last issue is it only counts activity on the website that you control. So these models have no idea, these Google Analytics models have no idea the last click or the non-direct last click. They don't know what you did on Facebook before you clicked. And they also have no idea if you saw a TV commercial or read an ad in a magazine, or you heard about it from a friend, or you saw someone famous using a product and you're like, oh, that's really cool. I want that watch. So there is no perfect answer is really what we're getting at here. But let's go back to Professor Box's quote from earlier and examine a little bit more. So the first part just says all models are wrong. And at the heart of attribution model is understanding that no model is going to be right. And all models are representative of the truth. And so no model is going to know that your favorite singer is wearing a cool watch. And if you saw an ad on a website a few weeks later, and then you search for it on Amazon before purchasing, there's just no model that's going to see all that and put that all together. But you may not realize what propaganda is working on you best, or you might even not realize that the order matters. At the end of the day, it's likely a combination of the whole that affects you. And it's possible too that if these actions happen in a different order, you might not have made that purchase at all. So how are we going to live our lives like that, right? Like I feel like I'm scaring everyone saying like, this is all wrong and there's everything is bad and all these different models have flaws. But there's a second part of this quote that's really important, which is some models are useful. So we need to come armed that our models are not perfect, but we also need models to survive. Without any ability to simplify reality, we'd never be able to make decisions, and especially based on data. So we need to know the strengths and weaknesses of our models and the models that support them before we can really start using them. So another interesting thing about a model is that the model with the most detail isn't always the best model. And I think a really good example are maps. So a map is a spatial model, right? What makes a model, it's only a representation of our space, but it can never be perfect. So here we have this cool one from Zoom Earth. That's this gorgeous picture. This is kind of the neighborhood that I live in, and it gets down to the individual trees and where they are and all the buildings. And so it's easily the prettiest map of where I live, and it's definitely one of the most detailed of like not only where things are located, but actual colors and things like that. So, but I have never used this map to solve a problem. For instance, if I wanted to drive from one point to another in this area, this would be my last resort. As much as it shows my world, it has data that I need, and it's missing data, or it has data I don't need at all, and then it's missing critical data as well. So here's Waze.
It definitely is, because I tried to guess where you lived just looking at this picture for about 5 minutes when I saw it. And it did not help.
It's hard to tell even where neighborhoods are, or where some businesses are once you get off this main street. It's called Manchester. Once you get off that, it gets pretty crazy. So here's Waze, and Waze removes a lot of the data. So here we have essentially the same geography, but the map or the spatial model, it's very different. The map removes realistic information on the trees, the buildings, the land, and the colors. Like these are not the colors of the world. And even to a certain extent, the exact locations are slightly tweaked in this model. And why does this matter? Well, I don't need any of that information. I'm trying to get from point A to point B in a car. And what I really need to know are the streets I need to take to get there. So in this Waze map, it's stripping out that stuff you'd find in Google Earth, but it actually added in a few other data points, like what are the names of the streets or even general areas. And it has this cool little thing, I don't know if you see at the bottom, it has this little, like there's construction going on. So that's something that is obviously important to know when I'm driving, not important to know if I was trying to survey, what is the height of different areas, I was trying to like do surveying for say oil or something like that. There's lots and lots of different maps for lots of different use cases. What I like to think of as a quote, it's often attributed to Albert Einstein, which is, don't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree. And I think that absolutely applies here. Knowing more about models can give you clues on how to use them best and not use them in the wrong situation. So let's look at kind of what's available in Google Analytics. So I'm just going to quickly try to walk through all of these. There's a lot here. So last click, first one we looked at, it really only includes the final step. Last click non-direct, it's the default for Google Analytics, and kind of ignores the direct if there's a previous step. Last AdWords click. So in this model, in this case, the first and only click to paid search campaign. So yeah, basically, if you clicked to on Google Ads at any point and you do something else later, it doesn't matter. It's going to give 100% credit to your paid search campaign. In the first interaction attribution model, I think we talked about that. That's sort of like the opposite of last one. So in this case, we're sort of looking at who actually initially drove the traffic. So let's say you clicked on Facebook a month ago, and then today you clicked on Google Ads and you converted. It's actually going to say Facebook gives 100% credit to Facebook. But you need to be aware of things like timeout. So if a click is more than 6 months old, or we're missing data, like for instance, you move from device to device, that might get lost, and then Google Ads might get that credit, even though there were activities before it. So now we're going to get into some more complex ones, but I think they're a little cooler. So the linear attribution model, each touch point in the conversion of the path would share equal credit. This and any non-last click models also has the same timing issue of the first click, but I think it's pretty cool because you're really saying like all these activities are now important. And you can see this, and just if there was any questions about this, you can't use most of these models in the normal Google Analytics interface. You have to go into the attribution section. So it has limited use actually in the interface, but you can pull this data out. You can actually construct it yourself too, and like say build out a SQL database using this data and actually look at all the different activities. So that's just something to keep in mind too. The time decay.
Just some comments coming in that a lot some people are using last interaction, but looking at others and trying to make sense of including display data. So just a little, as you're walking through some of these other models, Brett.
Yeah, and that's kind of the cool thing too here is like there's stuff beyond this, and I'll talk about this in the last probably like 10 or 15 minutes of other cool ways and how we kind of merge them together. But so the next one is, now we're getting just the complex stuff. The time decay attribution model. So the touch points closest in time to a sale or conversion gets most of the credit, but as older touch points are further in the past, they get less credit. So it's very similar to linear, except for, instead of equally distributed, it's giving more power to those touch points that are really close to the actual conversion. This is a really popular model, but it does have a lot of unknowns for people, like how that actual calculation works. I think this and linear are the two good models if you're only going to use a single model to understand data, as they distribute the data better than most of the other models and think about all these different touches. And studies have actually shown the difference between this model and linear are actually pretty small for most websites. So if you can't get buy-in for time decay, linear is nearly the same and a pretty good one that everyone kind of wrap their head around.
And is that because, like what you said, it's so hard to measure the propaganda that led someone to either, let's say your conversion is either, to fill out a contact form if you're a service, or it's to purchase something if you're e-commerce, right? Or any kind of product. Do both of those, linear and time decay, is that why it's important? Because it can take in sort of the unknowns?
It's a tough, I think it's just sort of, instead of like with the last click where you're just ignoring all those previous steps, time decay and linear are really thinking that all those interactions could be the interaction that kind of shaped why you did something on those intersections in your site. So we're not giving any weight in linear to saying like, oh, well, this one might have been it, or this one might have been the most important. Time decay starts to give weight to it and says like, well, if you're closer to making a purchase, I'm assuming that interaction is more likely to be that kind of catalyst for you making a decision.
So when these marketing folks are going to their CFO and asking for more money, instead of saying, we have to put all of our cash in this one channel because that, last interaction is getting all of this traction, Instead, they can say, here are the 5 different ways we're getting traction. Here's a model that kind of shows where we think it's coming from and how it's building. Let's use our financial dollars wisely between all of these.
Yeah, well, yeah, and you kind of split it. So let's say you had, I came to it from Facebook and then Google Ads, and then I converted. Well, it's going to give half a conversion to Facebook and half a conversion to Google Ads in the linear. Time to gain might be, well, there's a bigger gap between those 2 times. Maybe Facebook was like a month ago, and then you saw the Google Ads today. So maybe Google Ads in this case gets 70% and Facebook gets 30%. So you're saying like, okay, well, over time, we're seeing that Google Ads over many people is getting a little more value than Facebook, or maybe vice versa. So we can kind of better distribute that money instead of saying in our last click, oh, well, Google Ads is driving all the conversions. Let's put all our money there.
Got it.
Another one that actually is kind of cool is this position based. So 40% of the credit is assigned to the first interaction, and the remaining then 40% is kind of like given at the last position, and then 20% is kind of distributed between the other steps in between. So you're still counting those, but it's giving weight to those sort of like key steps. Like, how did you get me in here? And then how did you actually get me to make that final step and convert in whatever way. So I think that's pretty cool. And then the last one in the set is the craziest one. So data-driven attribution. This is machine learning. It uses what's called shapely value solution, and it's a concept from cooperative game theory to provide algorithmic attribution recommendations for each channel defined in your default channel grouping. I read that off because there's a lot there. And,
I was going to say.
yeah. So honestly, this is where a good understanding of math is needed. So the shapely values initially came from a core question in game theory, which is, say you have a group of player of different skill sets, and you have some sort of payoff at the end. What's the fairest way to divide up that payoff among the players? So it's really trying to say like how each player, basically the concept of if you remove this player, how much value would be lost. I am not a game theory expert, far, far from it. But my understanding is that this data-driven model tries to remove those confounding factors like the order of the different sessions of the source and how they're kind of affecting the overall numbers and sales. So the guy that invented it, actually, he's much smarter than me. And this model actually led him to receiving the Nobel Prize in economics. So it's very, very good. It's very awesome, but it's very complex. And so, I think it's very solid. And it's likely better than the simple models like last interaction and probably even linear or time decay. But it's not something that most people feel comfortable with because it's sort of a black box, right? It takes a lot of data, and it's not something you and I could process these kind of complicated math functions and process them literally millions of times between all your different data sets. That being said, if you can convince people and you can only use one model to understand your data, this might be the model. And it recently has been added to almost every Google Analytics account. In the attribution section, there's a new beta. You can come in and you can use the data-driven model. You don't have to pay for it anymore. It used to be like this thing where you had to pay Google like $10,000 a month to use the 360 version. It's now in beta to release to everyone. So it's kind of cool. You can go ahead and your Google Analytics, if you see that attribution beta, you can go ahead and start setting it up now, and then it'll start feeding it in data. Unfortunately, if you don't have a lot of conversions, it's going to say that you just don't have enough data because it really needs a lot of data to really be able to process it with any sort of certainty. There is actually one more model in Google Analytics that's not listed here, and this is called assisted conversions. So this is a number, or it could also be a monetary value of sales and conversions that a channel assisted. So if a channel appears anywhere except as the final interaction or conversion path, it's considered an assist for that conversion. These numbers are higher, and they can add up too. So we have this converted on Google Ads, it gets nothing in an assisted, but then Facebook, organic, and direct all each get a point of assisted points. So as you can see, it's not mutually exclusive. There's only one conversion here, but there's 3 assists. So it's something to keep in mind that they accumulate much faster than the actual conversions. I think there's a real use case for it, and we'll get into it here. There's a lot to go through here, and I realize we're running short on time. So I just want to touch on base that outside of Google Analytics, tools like Google Ads and Facebook, they also can bring in something really cool called view-through conversions. So that's where if you see an ad, but you don't click on it, it can still has the ability to look at that data and say, hey, you saw this ad and then you converted later because we have the pixel on your site. I'm able to say, okay, well, it may have had some influence on your conversion. So you're able to collect that, which is pretty cool. And then you can actually manipulate that, and you can manipulate how far back you want to look at clicks and how far back you want to look at views in Facebook. The other cool thing about Google Ads is it integrates with Google Analytics. So you can sort of take that single source of truth from Google Analytics and push it into Google Ads and use some of the same rules. So instead of Google Ads being a pixel and just saying like, oh, you know, there was a conversion here and I was part of that path somewhere along the line, I get full credit. You can actually say, hey, I only want to give you partial credit. I only want to do a linear or a time decay or whatever works best. So I'll skip through here because I know we're running kind of low on time. Yeah, so the view throughs also though, you can kind of control the time. And so basically it's very similar to that whole concept of session where you can customize this information out to great levels. So it kind of leads to three kind of core questions when I think about view through models. So first off is the data for the ad, view, or the conversion? And that sounds kind of confusing, but the date is very interesting. In the Facebook model, it gave the default option of 28 days of clicks to get a credit conversion. The interesting thing is the data can cause issues when you QA because you might have a $500 sale on Friday, but the click was on Tuesday. So Facebook's going to say you earned $500 on Tuesday, even though the actual activity was on Friday. And this gets really confusing when you show you had 80 Facebook conversions in June, but you only actually had 75 people convert in that month. Both Facebook and your CRM are accurate, but they're having different ways to assign dates. Dates are fluid and crazy, and they add a lot of headaches to reporting. Second, we have this whole concept of mutual exclusivity again. So not only can it be an issue between channels, but it could be an issue with the same channel where two ads can get credit for the same conversion. If, say, a user viewed both or clicked one and viewed another, or even clicked both. So work with your vendor to understand how that works. So if multiple ads get credit for the same conversion, you could say, oh, we had 100 conversions, when in reality you had 5. You know, who knows how many ads they might have saw. And then the last thing is, what is even considered a view? It seems kind of simple, right? Like, you saw my ad, right? But for instance, if only 50% of your ad is shown on a page and it's only viewed for 1 second, would you consider that a view? Would you say, oh, that's the view, that's what led to that conversion? I don't know about that. But many channels, when I've seen the reports, their rules say that's true. Oh, half of it was on the page for a second, it gets a point for the conversion. But I'm not sure it should. And so understanding that is a really good thing. So these are kind of the 3 questions I definitely would ask your vendor who's creating, you know, your display campaigns or whatever. How are these working? And one of the things I'd also like to caveat here is that we are recently working with a vendor who creates display campaigns, and they gave us last click conversions plus view through as a single metric. And to me, that's extremely frustrating because to me, the view through is sort of a passive behavior. You're passively seeing, maybe not seeing that ad, versus a click is a non-passive behavior. You're acting, right? And so I think those are very different. And to merge those together into a single metric is extremely misleading. And because first off, what if 99% of those, you know, conversions were actually view through and only 1 was a click through? I want to know that. I want to know what ads are driving traffic and what ads are not. And that's another thing that I think is really important to note is your marketing is going to be different for different parts of the funnel, right? I think Carolyn was talking about this earlier. Like, I want to know what's driving traffic. I want to know what people are seeing, and I want to know what's getting people to convert because I'm going to send different messages to those people. So that kind of leads to that last question is, this is what we get asked all the time. What is that perfect model? What do you recommend using above all else? And the answer is, well, actually, sorry. So the perfect model would tell you how much value you get from each source and what would happen if that source was removed, right? It reminds me very, very much of that one about the data-driven model, which is very complex. But even then, it makes a lot of assumptions. It doesn't know if you saw a billboard or you talked to your friend. So it really gets back to that idea of judging a fish by its ability to swim, right? Like, we want to put the model in the right place to be able to succeed. And so what our recommendation is, we start with, what are the questions? What do we want to know? And then we can determine what models are helping us swim or find the behavior we care about. So here, the questions I think are most critical as a marketer are, what sources drove awareness leading to a conversion? Like, who's getting, alerting people like, oh, maybe I want to make a purchase there. Then I also think it's very critical to say, like, okay, which ones are actually getting people to act and move to your site, whether or not they actually convert there, as long as they're eventually driving to conversions. You might call these like qualified leads, right? To a certain extent, where they're actually coming in and they're likely to convert. And then the last thing is, what are those sources that are getting people able to complete that conversion, right? Who's actually making that final step and getting them, people nudging people over the edge and saying like, okay, I'm ready to purchase. Because then we can kind of align our messages to each one of those. And the simple truth is, mapping goals to models, I think that you need to actually have different models for each one of these. So what we do is we break these 3 goals into types of conversions. But we must understand we can't add these together, right? So in this case, for driving awareness, I think view through conversions are extremely useful. But you kind of treat them with a grain of salt, right? There's what a view is may not actually be viewed. It's just sort of like the concept of, it could have been viewed by a user. It could have seen this. So you're probably going to have a lot there at the top of your funnel. What's important messaging there? The second thing of driving web traffic, I think assisted conversions is a really good match here, because it removes that whole concept of who's actually completing the conversion and just seeing what are those sources that are sort of doing a good job of getting you to the site, getting you there, and then hopefully leading you to conversion. And the last thing is completing conversions. I think the last click, and I would say the last click non-direct is really good here, because first off, you get all the advantages of working with all the different Google Analytics data when you're looking at this. So just always have that caveat that you understand that this is only one piece of the puzzle when you're looking at that data. This is what are those steps that are finally driving that conversion? So the problem is, although combining models is really great for marketing folks, especially people in the weeds and you're trying to make decisions, even with great diagrams and explanations, sometimes executives and stakeholders, they will never get comfortable with this, and you explain this to them again and again and again, and they just don't get it. They're just very busy with other things. So I would recommend that using this combination is great for the people who are iterating, improving, and growing your marketing efforts, but maybe for people who you're reporting your success to, your stakeholders, your executives, you might just give them one model if that's what they're comfortable with. And in that case, I would probably either recommend, ideally, if you can get them on board the data-driven model, it's going to give the most weight in the most valuable channels, but it's kind of that black box. It's hard to explain. So there might be problems there of getting people to buy in and think that that's real. I think if you can't do that, the linear model or position-based model, they're pretty balanced. They're easy to understand. And I think people could wrap their heads around them. I think moving people away from when you're reporting to executives of this last click or last click non-direct, it's just you're ignoring so much information that they could be really making decisions and or telling you like, hey, stop spending money on Facebook because it's not driving any conversions, when really you could be causing major problems to your marketing. But I actually have a third recommendation, and this is sort of when you get further along. And the next step for most companies is building your own model. So at some point, your organization is going to become mature enough that they're going to need a model. And a custom model does a couple really cool things. it's weighted to how your business works. So if you have particular activities that you know are more critical or less critical in based off of your business, you can kind of weigh it differently. You can also weigh times. You can control so much when you build it yourself. And then the other incredibly awesome thing is you can start including data from multiple platforms. So like Google Analytics and HubSpot, you can mix those together so you can see how marketing and sales activities are kind of acting together in a really cool way. Because maybe if have the best leads coming in from Facebook, but only if you're emailing them, and if you're calling them, they seem to drop off the map. So it's kind of a good way to kind of see that and see that path going forward. So we actually built one for our CRM, and then we merged it with Google Analytics behavior to kind of build these models. We built this one in SQL, and then we use Data Studio to visualize it. So it sort of looks like this, where you kind of have these different mediums all mixed together. So you have the newsletter, you have the email marketing, and then you have cold calls, you have Google ads, you have Facebook, all in there together. So you can kind of see, okay, what is kind of like the best at really driving conversions. And you can even, what we've done before is broken this into like sales qualified leads, marketing qualified leads, and wins, because each one of those, that medium might shift around. So you might say, hey, getting these sales qualified leads, we really need to be aggressive at cold calls or whatever. But here in this case, the wins, you have this MQL call, this marketing qualified call is higher up there on this list. And the email newsletter is really good at driving them. So just thinking about all these things together is really cool. So just kind of a different things. And I know I pushed our time pretty aggressively, but I would definitely love to be open for any questions. And I thank everyone for kind of going through this. I hope that wasn't too intense or too crazy all over the place.
I think it was great. Probably I also love the quote from Albert Einstein, don't judge a fish by how well it can climb a tree. That's one of my favorite quotes. And I think that it gives everyone a little bit of time to give themselves some permission to make some mistakes, but also know how to move the needle, how to step it up a little bit. So thank you, Brett, for all of that enlightening information. Looks like we have a couple comments here. Don't have any particular questions coming in per se, but thanks for the informative webinar session. As always, inspiration and strategy using touch attribution as an example of how to encourage privacy data and consent. Love that, love that. Don't need to mention out loud, but my last report to my boss looks very similar to these 3 ideas with these 3 steps. So I love to see that we're already kind of putting that into action. If anyone has any questions, make sure to reach out. I have my contact information up at the beginning of the chat. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to pass anything along to Brett as well. Keep in mind, we do have a very short survey. I know people are not a fan of surveys, but it is 4 questions. So if you could help us out, we would love to know how we're doing, what you want to hear more about in future webinars. So when we end the meeting, a little pop-up poll will pop up. I'd love for you to take a look at that. And otherwise, Brett, do you have any final last words?
No, I appreciate everyone taking the time. This is complicated stuff, so I try to jam as much as I could into the hour. I could talk about this for days if we had to. So if you ever
maybe we'll do a follow-up webinar. If you want a follow-up webinar to this, a follow-up webinar to attribution modeling, make sure that you let us know on that poll. We'd be happy to either do this one again or do a variation of it. Keep an eye out on your inbox. We will be sending you the recording of today so that you can go back and take a look at it again. It's going to include all the chats, all the comments. But other than that, we are so thankful that you're here. I did also put a link in there. We are doing YouTube videos. We're posting them on LinkedIn and Facebook. They are very short tutorials that Brett and his team are putting together, anywhere from 1.5 minutes to 4 minutes long. They cover things like custom data and Google Analytics. They cover things like third-party pixel tracking, attribution modeling, anything under the sun that you need, those videos are there. So again, that LinkedIn link that I put out there, that's our company link, and it's gonna have all the posts and all the videos for you guys to watch on your own time. So we'd love to hear your thumbs up on that, your comments on those. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We are so happy that you were able to spend some time at home with us. So have a great afternoon, enjoy your Wednesday, and hopefully we'll catch you on the next webinar. Bye, guys.
Thank you.